Okay, so as I said, this is being recorded. So welcome to the first module, Module 1, The Roots of White Supremacy, part of the series on behalf of OMLTA and Ministry of Education. My name is Flora Villas. I am one of the directors of OMLTA, and this is for the series titled How to Become an Anti-Racist FSL Educator. Today, we have the great pleasure of having the two educators that created this specific module, Mullen Evans Sinclair and Emma Lind, who put everything together, put incredible amount of time, effort, and work, and their knowledge and research and everything into creating this. And so I will hand it over to the two of you.
Thanks so much, Flora.
Thank you.
It's a real pleasure to be with you all and to have been a part of this innovative project. I was really excited at the first mention of it because it seems to be really tackling these issues from a deep and authentic place. It did not seem like compliance level training. It did not seem like some sort of online PowerPoint that you click through to get to the end to get some badge. It was a real engagement with anti-racism for other educators, and it felt like really meaningful work to sink our teeth into.
Similarly, like I agree with you, Emma. When I got the ask to be involved, I was very excited. I wanted to have this conversation. I typically do this conversation for my work. Fun fact for those like on the call, myself and Emma have worked together prior in doing consultancy on anti-racism and anti-oppression. So it was a really good opportunity for the two of us to think about all the things that we know in terms of the content, but then really package it for who our audience was this time and what the ask required of those who are part of the FSL community to do with regards to learning this, implementing this, and then doing something for, I guess, students in the schools that they work in as well. So it's really a great opportunity.
Yeah. So as Mullen mentioned, the two of us had worked as anti-racist educators for consulting in the private and public sectors, where we were doing workshops and coaching with professionals, adults, in other words. And so we knew each other as colleagues, but we both also are educators in our other life. I teach at the post-secondary level in gender studies. I'm located in the unceded Syilx territory in what's otherwise known as colonial British Columbia. And Mullen, do you want to say a couple more words about your day job?
Yes, totally. So similar to Emma, I've been an educator for a good number of years. My current work is in the independent sector in Canada. And so, yeah, working as a director of equity, diversity and inclusion at a girl-focused school, Midtown Toronto, and really trying to get my head around what that means for me, an immigrant and a settler. I use both of those specifically with regards to my relationship to being here. And what does that mean with the understanding of anti-racism education in also a colonialist language, so, adjacent to English, but with the twin and tied history of English in this country too, and being aware of the messaging that we are trying to get across and the impact that that can have. So yeah.
So we've known each other in the context of delivering anti-racism content to adults. And I'm curious how, as an educator working currently in the secondary school system, right? I'm wondering, how do you approach the topic of race and racism in the classroom to a secondary school demographic? Where do you start? Because we were tasked with the first module of this series. All of the modules were delicious, right? The Roots of White Supremacy was the title for ours, and it was already like
charged.
It felt like pressure's on. This is big. We got to dig deep. So I'm curious, where in the past have you started with your roots lesson plan?
So really good question. And so this school, the school that I currently work in, is all through. So the specific experience that I have is in education of secondary age students, correct? And at the same time, the challenge of working where I work at the minute is everybody from day dot all the way to the last day of formal education, when they go off to university or the world of work. And I guess for me, two things come to mind. So there's an image that I made use of in our session, and I will pull it up right now because I think it gives a great understanding as to where my mind came from in thinking about the approach that I take to it. So if you bear with me for one moment, I will get that slide up. And it does a nice job of kind of explaining where I am situating myself. Oh no. Okay, because I clicked the wrong thing. I do know how to use Zoom, I promise you. So how I look at it, and this is my lovely picture on the right-hand side, is this particular image here. And this image is how I view the understanding of what is asked of us as educators, as people who work with young folk, and in general, anyone that's committed to doing civil rights work. And this, to me, is civil rights work. How do we actually look at it? So what you've got here is, and you would have seen this in the presentation, you would have heard this on the video, the green line is kind of, I guess, what most people's approach to how schooling works with regards to roots of white supremacy or roots of any oppression that takes place. The idea that if I don't add anything to it, if I'm not responsible for creating the mess, then I don't really have any responsibility in cleaning up the mess because, you know, I put my little one into a school at 4 years old and they leave the school at 18 years old, and whatever happens along the way, as long as I'm not guilty to adding anything that would come out the other end as being more oppressive, my job is done. I'm a good parent. They come from a good household. You know, I can give myself a bit of a pat on the back. But what actually is true is that the school system itself, the systems that we all are part of themselves, like it is the yellow line. It's already biased. It's already historically set up for some people to get more and some people to get less. And that more or less can be attention, that more or less can be representation of themselves, that more or less can be hypervigilance, and hypervigilance and attention are two different things. So you can be more hypervigilant, surveillance in terms of hypervigilance in that respect, but you can also get less attention in terms of your actual needs in the schooling situation. So what does that actually look like when you think about the roots of white supremacy? So I'm more likely to see you as being Black when there is an opportunity to put danger or a possibility to think about, you know, the idea of where does the threat lie? Where might there be an opportunity for something negative to happen to me as a non-Black person, specifically in this situation, a white person? But that hypervigilance goes to lack of attention when it goes to what might be the specific experience for Black folk, where, you know, the data that's out there says that the age of 4 is when it's the highest concentration of racist incidents happens to kids when they're around age 4. And that's because, to me, you know, the way how I look at that is, if you grow up in a Black household or a non-white household, everything around you, pretty much your caregivers, your, you know, the reflections of who you are, everything looks like you. And then you go to a school situation in a white majority country or in a system that is heavily predicated on white supremacy, and you don't see yourself. And the questions as to my foods, my customs, my languages, my ways of beings, that's jarring to the wider space that I'm in. And if the educators in that space are not prepared to have the conversation around aspects of yourself that you can bring to the school, aspects of yourself that you should bring to the school, aspects of yourself that are welcome into the school, all of those things are actually part of that yellow line that we often assume is the green one, where it's, you know, I'm not adding anything, I'm not doing anything to this kid, I'm just letting it play out and it will come out in the wash. And by the time they're 18, all of this racism and oppression and, you know, transphobia, homophobia, everything, all these phobias and isms, they'll just kind of rectify themselves by the end and it'll all balance out. If you're a white kid at the age of 4 and you go to a school in a white majority country, again, I use my specific context of an independent school, which historically has been created for segregation. You are not really paying attention to your surroundings because home and school and everywhere else looks like you. So there is no requirements to question why that difference might exist for you. But there also isn't a space for you to question why the sort of tacit conversations around supremacy. So, you are different, I am normal. That leads to your difference becomes less than. That leads to a whole actual understanding of the canon reflects us and the difference is you. That education also isn't partly there for those 4-year-olds all the way to 18. So to finish, I guess that gray line is what we're looking for. The idea that everybody's work is to really wrestle back that line, and you have to overcorrect. You have to go further than what the line is asking for, so that those kids from the age of 4 all the way through to 18 actually have a better chance at getting somewhere to center and somewhere to neutral in their lifetime, because what we inherited is not something that we're going to fix in ours. So it's a really comprehensive answer to a really good question, but I thought I would use that image as a way to illustrate that.
No, I love that. As you were speaking at one point, you were talking about ways in which Black students are read by non-Black teachers. That it might be easy to see Blackness in the context of threat or problem, but not necessarily, you didn't use this language, but all I could think of was humanity, like not in terms of like the students' needs, their own development, their own, And one pattern I've noticed when talking with mixed race groups about race, when I talk to white folks about racism, the problem is often one about justice. So I've seen this in activist spaces, white folks who are angry about racism and really want to like bond over the anger, or make self-deprecating jokes, a kind of grumpy attitude about racism. You know where that it's an allied position. When I speak to friends of color, in any case, the conversation about racism is often one of pain.
Mm-hmm.
Injustice, sure, but like when you talk about the 4-year-old as experiencing the most racism, per minute in their life, that's some sort of height, it's like it just hit me in a really tender spot.
And I think there's something in that too, to that point, to zoom out. I'm hoping that the educators who do not identify as a person of color are thinking about that question that you mentioned about justice, right? And so when you think about justice and when you think about allying to justice, I think one of the things that can re-inflame that site of pain for some of the non-white folk, and really thinking about the roots of white supremacy here and the systems of it, the allyship isn't asked of towards one person or one incident or one historical episodic moment of oppression or racism. In this case, the allyship is being asked against the system that causes those things. So the allyship to me is recognizing that you are being an ally to the integrity that says, let's upend the roots of white supremacy. Let's pull those roots up. Let's, go dig as deep as we can to work out where they start from. Let's cut them off so that they don't keep perpetuating themselves, much less the flower shoots that pop up above the ground. And so those moments, sure, it's a truism that you live with the pain and the discomfort, but you also have to continue living as a person of color through those. What I really would like educators to think about is, it's not for the episodic story moments alone that you are rallying and galvanizing yourself around. It's the integrity to say that even if it doesn't exist in my classroom, the data suggests that it exists in a classroom in this school somewhere. So how do I ensure that I'm doing the best work I can to ally myself against, continuing to happen, and ally myself with the integrity of upending that or removing that from where it is.
But also, spoiler alert, it is in your classroom, right? It's like oxygen. It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. So this myth of like, oh, not in my classroom or not in my school. It's like, we need to change the channel if we're gonna be in conversation at all, you know?
Absolutely.
But when you talk about like the random shoots, to me, that's where a lot of the white on white conversations I've had wind up. Like, okay, I noticed racism blossoming in this one particular part of the plant. How do I address that? How do I just like cut it off and then we'll be okay, right? And that's part of the work, right? You definitely need a toolkit for a kind of list of best practices to ensure that you're pruning where you need to prune. But I wasn't able to actually talk about the roots of white supremacy until I looked at my own story and could retell my own life story differently. I can't start the story as citizen neutral, right? I have to fill in the silences that my family has been really committed to maintaining. Not in terms of our crimes, though that's part of it, right? But in terms of the ways, the ways that we try to make colonialism look normal in these territories. The way that I get excited when I see cobblestone streets in Quebec. I mean, and I'm not trying to demonize that, but in those moments where I'm excited about the cobblestones, I'm romanticizing Canada's relationship to colonialism. I understanding that it's being passed, a system of violence is being passed off as charming, right? And how long have I been in these territories? And what makes me think that my body looks like it belongs when it's an immigrant body we pretend is not?
It's fascinating that you say that part too, because I'm thinking about someone who is, I want to say European descent, but European origin in the context of what we're speaking about. The amount of times I've heard Quebec is like the most European part. Like it's the most European part of Canada. Like you really should go to Quebec, like Quebec City specifically, Montreal, like go there. Like it will give you some sort of link back to the European flavor of things. And it's fascinating because partly I'm like, well, why do you think I left? So it's partly that, right? I wanted to try something new.
Oh, I've got you frozen for a bit.
Innocence of that
Oh,
statement,
hang on,
the
pause,
weight of what that statement.
Pause. You froze for a bit, so you were in a really weak moment,
No
and I just
problem.
want to make sure we get the wit.
No
You were saying,
I was saying the innocence that statement comes with, but the undercurrent weight that statement is also giving, and it's fascinating being a Black identified individual, being asked to remark Europe, also a place where the roots of white supremacy originated, and so being asked to have a relationship to that place. If I were to think about the idea of being French as second language teachers as well, that complication I'm sure comes up in the classroom too. The idea that you're teaching another European language, you're also being asked to wrestle with its origin. So we're talking specifically European French, not necessarily Quebecois French. So like that understanding, recognizing that the demographic of French speakers in Canada is very vast. So you have Haitians, you have a lot of African French speakers as well in the country. You have people whose French was put upon them in their Métis identities as well. So you have a spread of where this French comes up. And it's just fascinating how just little comments, can seem very innocent, but the roots again of what that white supremacy is, it's really easy to overlook. And so, as you said, it's in the air that we breathe, it's in the water that we drink, it's everywhere. So questioning some things requires you really to I guess dig deep and really understand that is that comment, how do I sit with that comment? How would I teach that comment to kids, especially if I'm a person of color teaching French in schools? How do I also sit with that comment when I'm also trying to teach another language that is also European descent and that also has had a canonical aspect of imperialism and supremacy attached to it too?
And paradoxically, that in relationship to English has been minoritized.
Absolutely.
So within the class hierarchy of white settlers, the French have been minoritized in Canada. And so I want to be honest about that, and honest about the fact that the ethnocentrism imposed upon French speakers was very similar to an ethnocentrism imposed upon the Irish and Italians and Ukrainians and people of European descent who were racialized as ethnic others, and who pass as white. I mean, I do know, and this shows up socially, where there'll be someone with a white person with a French name, and they'll talk about the shame of their grandparents being forced not to speak the language. And in those moments, I always think there's a little window open. There's empathy moment where we can draw the links between the shame of speaking French to the shame of speaking other non-Anglo languages in these lands, and how Anglo supremacy has been the pressure to conform to one type of standardized ideal that privileged, the crown.
It's very true.
To me, it feels like a contradiction to hold. And I think I don't know how to get out of it other than to frame it as a contradiction. It's a paradox, and we have to make room for it, because it won't be a clean story.
It won't be. And I think that's a really good question to ask as well, of us to each other in the space as well. I know that when we decided to come together and do this module, obviously we are oppositionally, if you like, identified in terms of race and gender. But there was also a need to explore what do modules that title themselves as roots of white supremacy, of roots of anything, what do they often get wrong that we were trying to avoid? What were some of the things that they get right that we're trying to amplify? And again, not forgetting that our audience is those who then have to stand up and do this, day to day, Monday through Friday. So I was wondering for yourself, what were some of the pitfalls that you wanted to avoid when creating this module?
I didn't want to talk about white supremacy without talking about whiteness. Because if we talk about white supremacy only, we talk about the crimes, and that's important. But then it also implies that there are good white people and there are bad white people. Here, be a good white person. And I wanted to trouble and disrupt the idea that whiteness is real. And that I've never really figured out a way to say this cleanly or quickly, but I'm part of many circles that are very critical of gender roles, right? I teach gender studies. I teach a class on masculinity. I often have 20-year-old men in my classroom expressing frustration about the pressure the culture puts on them, wanting a different type of masculinity that isn't toxic. And we can all agree that gender is a bit of a fiction in that way. We simultaneously identify with it, but we also know it's imposed upon us. I want to develop a way of speaking about whiteness that's that way, because whiteness has been invented in order to trick people into thinking that human beings are different from each other. And it seems that everybody who's not in a white body is having that conversation all the time. And white-bodied folks only ever talk about their bodies in the context of disability or body image or gender. In terms of race, white people, in my experience, really think it's a conversation not for them. And so I want to talk about the pressures on white people to keep acting white, to pass as white, the class anxiety, to use the right fork and pretend you know how to smell wine before they pour the full glass. Like, these are white performances, right? So I think that there's a kind of popular recognition that white supremacist ideas are bad and racist, but there's not a popular understanding that whiteness is a myth that we're allowed to reject, the way we're allowed to reject machismo or, the pressure to be Barbie. Like,
yeah, it's really profound. Really, really, really profound. No, it's got me thinking, like, in thinking about my own answer to that same question. One of the things I was trying to, it really ties in nicely. I wanted to focus on the idea of segregation also existed here, and every outcome that we currently live with right now is as a result of an intentional choice that was made at a point prior. And so to what you're speaking to, whether we acknowledge it for what it is or whether we continue to parade it for what it was said to be, schools exist on a continuum. And if you think on a continuum, one end of inclusive to exclusive, you think on one end, progressive to conservative, every school type that exists in this country is on that continuum, including residential schools, which we rarely ever talk about. They are, if you think about that same continuum, exclusive to whom? And at the expense of what inclusivity?
Yeah.
Progressive of what ideology? At the expense of conserving what idea or program, for the country. When you think about the idea that, the segregation existed here. And so what does that do for, and I looked at it with regards to Black identified folk, I looked at it with regards to Indigenous folk, and I looked at it in regards to white women, but like the agenda for women's education in the first place, all of those things were specifically intended to segregate and to uphold and to maintain. So to your point about things being structures, I was listening to a really good book. It's called Raising White Kids. And one of the things that it talks about is the idea that everything that is a structure is conceived as an idea, but then you can reimagine that conception. So if you think a house is a structure, a house is it's a real embodiment of a structure, but a house can be torn down and reimagined. So it doesn't mean that because the house or the structure exists, that's the only way for it to exist. It can be torn down, it can be reimagined, it can be rebuilt. And so similar to this understanding, we need to know that this was the image of what houses were, to know if we still like it. Does it still serve us? Is it helpful? Do we want to live in it? Is this the street that we want to be on? And if not, and if we, get to a place where we can be honest about it not serving us, let's tear it down, right? It existed at a time for a reason. It no longer needs to be the thing that we consistently refer to when talking about structures as they are.
I love that.
Got a question?
We've got questions from our audience.
Looking in the chat, exactly. So go ahead.
So, do you think that some white folks would counter whiteness with stating that those practices and beliefs are part of their culture? Sometimes, but in my experience, whiteness is white. If you're doing white properly, you don't have a culture. That's something other people have. So I find that whiteness demands that white-bodied folks deny their culture, disavow their culture, pass. I think of, the history of anglicizing names, or I think of food. I think of how I grew up in the prairies, and a lot of, my last name has one syllable. And I was in the minority in terms of kids that had one syllable for a last name or two syllables. Ukrainian names are much longer. And so a lot of the settler kids that I was raised with had really long, compared to the WASP name I have, really long names. And when they would go to their family farm, they would have babas, they didn't have grandmas. And they would always have cabbage rolls and pierogies. Like, my family didn't cook that food, right? Like, they didn't, there was no overtly self-conscious way that my family felt ethnic. And because of that, I think whiteness can be something white people struggle to name, because so much of their identity is predicated upon not seeing themselves as ethnic. I mean, at the same time, now that I'm terribly articulate and adult and middle-aged, I've done my work, I could tell you more about, my Anglican background and how, and the fact that my family has tartans and stuff. But, growing consciously, that wasn't language my family ever self-consciously uses. Sorry, Mullen.
No, thank you. Because that was literally the thing that's fascinating. That a version of that question also came up with regards to, whiteness and culture. And it's true, the idea about these things are just, they're they're not white, they're just a cultural thing. But
Right.
what's fascinating is when you then think about areas that white folk can't see, the white supremacy and what they're talking about that others can. So a quick, easy one would be to talk about the crown, as you know already discussed. So the passing of the last monarch and
Yeah.
passing to the current monarch,
Yeah.
the one side of that or you're the other, right? And so if you, in terms of talk about white culture just it almost asks you to accept that there's a monarchic cult-like structure. That's just something that we have. Like we just know
Yeah.
that there's a queen, there's a head of state, there's
Yeah.
but the moment that you question, but is that cultural to you or is that white? Becomes a bit of a discombobulation because what do you mean? Like it's just a thing. It's just it just is and is. Like what do you mean as a cultural appreciation of WASP norms again, right? Because France French folk, so European French folk, and their relationship to monarchy, very different conversation than Anglo European folk and their relationship to monarchy. So if you want to think about, where the cultural lines come, you kind of want to go back to the origin story of Europe. But because we're in the Canadian context of things, to your point about French being minoritized and co-opted into white, there's just this appreciation of like, yeah, but everyone follows the crown. Everyone is King Charles. But that isn't the case. And that's in some places that still isn't the case. But there's an attitude that it's just whiteness. It's not a cultural thing that people are being asked to buy into. So what is the difference between a tartan and a kente? Kente cloth being West African, specifically Ghanaian. Like, what is the difference between those? One of these things is just normal. Our school uniforms have kente, has tartans, right? But if you were to wear your cultural dress as a non-white person, that's cultural. This is uniform. So there are ways that you can see it, but it doesn't necessarily want to read itself as being cultural. It just wants to read itself as being white noise. No pun, but yes.
As passing.
As passing.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I have just another question for you that this made me think of this in terms of activities that I've done in my French classrooms with in grade 9 with my students. And one in particular was talking about with questions that I asked them. It was just kind of a dialogue about cultural practices that they do with their family. And the white identified students felt very uncomfortable because they did not know how to answer questions such as cultural practices, traditions, beliefs, celebrations, etc., all of these different things. And even currently in my Spanish class, talking about family, comparing their family to a Latina familia. And so there is such a level of discomfort, and there is definitely this feeling of wanting to escape. And almost in terms of their reactions, feeling as though it's unfair for them to do an assignment. And so I wonder if, speaking to what you both have shared, would it help in a way, I guess, if maybe there is part of it as well, is that white folks just feel that discomfort, and maybe if they just kind of admitted there is a lack of culture and ethnicity, is that what makes them feel uncomfortable? Because many do not have a hard time accessing other ethnicities in terms of their practices and just things as music, movies, this and that. But in terms of the other way around, we're talking about power and rights. That's when it's like, well, no, you can't touch this, but we can access everything of yours. And it's sometimes I don't want to simplify it as, well, just admit that you don't have an ethnicity, you don't have a culture, or maybe there are certain things that aren't the same. And what kind of a difference do you think that would make then?
Well, it's interesting that what you're describing to me reads as fragility. They get all frozen and fragile, but do they understand that their Christmas tree is ethnic? Right? Like, do they understand that chocolate chip cookies are ethnic? Because they are. But if you're making cookies that aren't mass produced by Christie's, that aren't available in every supermarket. You might understand yourself to be making ethnic cookies at home where your culture exists, because the rest of the time you're in a broader culture where you understand yourself as outsider. But the thing about being white is there's no code switching. So by code switching, I mean adapting your behavior to suit the environment as you move from home to school to street to law office. It's an echo chamber for people who believe themselves to be white. One place I find that white people can understand themselves a bit easier in terms of what whiteness demands they hide is by asking questions about class in order to access the stories about race. So white people will not have the language to talk about my ethnicity, but they might have the shame about their grandmother's shag carpet. They might talk about how when their father got a promotion, they upgraded the china that they serve their dinnerware on. And so their feelings of belonging will be marked by class because their bodies remain white through class mobility. Oh, does this sound too academic?
No, I think it sounds exactly that. Listen, what you just said is exactly the point. It's the access points. It's like, what are the access points that our kids are able to understand? And so sometimes it is a question of, all right, go 2 generations up. So you're telling me that you don't have a culture. Cool, no worries. Go one step up. At what point, did your family immigrate to the country? At what point did you, and even me as a Black Brit, sometimes those questions evoke different answers from the students, because I'm saying to them that, my accent means that I do have an element of that classism, that class upswing that gives me benefit in Canada, right? So if you didn't know who I was, if you just heard my voice, you wouldn't necessarily put this skin tone to this voice. And so that's a bit of an upswing that happens here. But there is an understanding that, even if the videos that I play for you or the conversations that we have, think about whose accents you don't hear. And then think about the genericism of the accents that become a standardized Canadian accent or a standardized British accent. Like, a lot of them try to mimic my accent. And I think, my accent it's not the best one from back in the UK. It's really not. It's not an RP accent. But
what's RP?
Oh God, received pronunciation. So the newsreader of like the 50s and 60s, right? So I don't have that accent.
Received pronunciation? Please unpack that. What does that mean?
It's almost like it's the most neutral of accents.
Because I was like, it sounds racist.
It is extremely classist, because it was, if you imagine the British Broadcasting Corporation of the 60s and 70s, that as the colonies and the empire and that sort of speak, and the Pathé News, that sort of received pronunciation, your tongue is literally forced at the top of your mouth, that sort of pronunciation. Ian McKellen, great example, speaks that sort of accent.
Do you know about RP?
Yeah, so like like I think a lot of the actors and like the theater folk in the UK, especially the ones who graduated from, was that called like RADMA or RADFA or whatever that Royal Academy of Dramatic Fine Arts, blah blah blah. Were I don't know about now. I think I've seen like more of a more diversity in accents and tones coming out of the UK, but like when I think of RP, I think of Ian McKellen and Gandalf.
Okay.
And to finesse that point, it's literally that. It's like go 1 generation up. At what point do you stop sounding like you? Right? At what point does someone have a different accent? At what point does the food stop being bland and it starts to be different? At what point are pierogies involved in the mix? At what point potatoes and cabbage is like the thing that you like? At what point does that happen? That's the point at which the culture, as you say, on-ramping into something different, that's where that takes place. And so being able to access those conversations around class are a great one.
And the 1 generation up thing is so significant, particularly in North America, because the 20th century was a narrative of economic expansion for settlers. So, a different century we would tell the story differently. But when I think about whiteness today, I think about something that's been building over the last 100 years to get to the specific ways in which it's hyperlocated on the body today. It's obviously it's been around much longer than 100 years, but it changed over the course of the last 100 years. There's a question in the Q&A. How do we address the arguments that focus on fighting white supremacy promotes hate, division, instead on bring people in and building reconciliation?
So when we talk about reconciliation, the first part of that is truth, right? So we talk about truth and reconciliation. The first thing that we have to actually do is to address the truth. I think it is let's just be real. When we talk about how do we address the arguments, I think there's an internal, there's an interpersonal, and then there's an institutional way of looking at it. The internal one is to recognize it for what it is, which is a distraction. It doesn't actually support the conversation being had, because what it's asking you to do is to call it something else than what it actually is, which is, and the act of reconciliation means that you have to acknowledge that an act of, I don't know, wrecking, not the correct word to use, was done in the first place. So if we're reconciling, it's on account of some breakage somewhere. So we have to address the conversation live in ourselves and say that, you know, it is not true that I'm causing more division by accepting that something happened that was not great. We can just start there. And then on the interpersonal piece, it's the conversation that says, okay, you know, all of the arguments that happened so long ago, no one in this generation, why are we bringing up the past, etc., etc., etc. Multiple ways that I can go. You know, we still acknowledge 9/11 to this day. We still will do a minute of silence on November 11th to this day. Right. We will still have, you know, vestiges. Every major city has a cenotaph of something that happened in Europe to this day, right? So there are ways that, again, to your point about how sometimes whiteness is just an assumed norm and we don't question it, these things are memorial sites to a way that we looked at the nothingness or the sort of one directional historical charge that's happened before. So even addressing it from that conversation of, so, you know, is it fair to say that we should never talk about this, but then we always talk about that? Is it fair that, you know, a day and a minute silence and recognition of this is really being destroyed and upended and divisive if we take the time to also talk about this? I don't think that those things are hard to conceptualize, but it really takes a bit of resolve to say that actually it starts from the perspective of it's a non-equal argument in the first place, which allows you to then get to the institutional, which allows you to really question, what do we celebrate? What do we acknowledge to be just normal? What are the things that we don't even bat an eyelid around? And are those the things that we in our micro institutions of our classrooms or our schools or our school boards, at those levels of institutions, are we willing to continue just to keep going, or do we want to do something different? And it kind of gets to that critical mass point where the structures start to change. But I think it starts from that internal understanding of it's not a true charge of the conversation. I don't know what you think, Emma.
Well, I agree with everything you just said. I agree with everything you just said. I couldn't help but think, as I was reading the question, about the ways in which people dismiss the use of the word feminist. And what I say to my students is there's a well-organized backlash against validating the very strong arguments that people have made about systemic gender oppression. And so feminism speaks into that silence. And similarly, white supremacy speaks to that. White supremacy is not talking about white-bodied people. It's talking about a system. And if we trick ourselves into thinking that it's talking about white-bodied people, then we're never going to be able to look at this as a system-wide issue. So to me, that question is one asked by white-bodied folks who are feeling defensive and fragile. And I think we need to be honest that like there are ways in which white supremacy is also not serving them. Like white supremacy is asking them to deny parts of themselves, to deny their own humanity, to believe that their humanity is based upon the exploitation of others, to pass, you know, like if we all reject white supremacy, we're all better for it. Because what we're fundamentally rejecting is this notion that our bodies are arranged in a hierarchy and some people are more civilized than others. When we can reject that, we can all be who we are and we can just be fabulous. I didn't know that answer was in there, but I liked it.
It really also helps to, it reframes what you're, you know, what you're put on this planet to do, right? Just to really punctuate that last part. If your view is to uphold white supremacy as a structure, you are forever finding ways. Your every waking conscientious moment is, how do I pass better? How do I fold in better? How do I not agitate? How do I, you know, get cookies in terms of, you know, job well done for keeping up the system, and not to get all anarchic and you know, sort of tear it down about it, but it literally also is that thing for one's own internal health structure, rejecting the feeling of having to show up every day to perform whiteness. It's like it gives you a bit of a break to be like, you know what, this is good enough and I'm fine with this, and this is the body I was assigned at birth. This is the one that I'm going to roll with. And so I think even in terms of, you know, self-healing and internal work that way as educators, the job is hard enough. We are trying to hold a previously existing system one end whilst building the plane as we fly it to change the system for those who are coming through after us. It's a hard job. And so even showing up in ways that allow us to not have to be co-opting into something that we know is damaging to ourselves, that has to be better than consistently showing up, first one to clock in, last one to clock out, to a system that is just going to keep asking more and more and more, shaving off of oneself to fit in. So it's just
like I'm even looking at the color I'm wearing. I'm like, is this what my soul wanted? Right? Does this light me up? Or is this about passing? Because don't I look kind of appropriate and civilized and bourgeois? But like, is that really, you know what I mean? Like anyway, just
totally. It's an ongoing piece, an ongoing piece of work.
Yeah.
How deep do those roots go?
Exactly.
Wondering if there are any other questions real quick before we sign off from...
I see one about the crossroads of white supremacy, roots, and feminism.
You go first. This is also your forte, Emma.
I know, pressure's on. The roots of white supremacy and feminism. I would argue that, I mean, as a movement for liberation, feminism has been about trying to democratize the system and claim citizenship status within a system designed, like I tell my students, like the first people who were allowed to be citizens in Canada were old, rich white men who owned property. And then it slowly democratized, and other groups, you know, were included and continue to be included. And yet the system, the structure as it was designed was always for these folks. And so I see feminism, you know, it's got its goal of liberation, but practically as it tried to expand the franchise, was always at risk of being seduced by other hierarchies, right? Like white supremacy. And so those who were able to access greater access to citizenship within the feminist movement were those who already had the class-based tools, the race-based tools, privileges, so that their gender became the one focus. And so when I think about the roots of white supremacy and feminism, I think anytime feminists argue for something on the basis of gender alone, as opposed to anytime sexism is described as sexism and not a racist sexism or a sexist racism, anytime we are encouraged not to adopt an intersectional lens, white supremacy is happening, because white supremacy loves single identity issues, because it wants us to be separated. The minute we identify the ways we're all integrated, white supremacy gets threatened and destabilized.
Couldn't have said it better.
Less Mullen. It's like any sense. Anyway.
That's incredible. Thank you both so much. Michael and I, actually, Michael has just made a comment, and I was doing the same thing of taking notes, especially a few of the highlights, especially with the way that you both talked about white performances. And then Mullen, you also just finished talking about that as well with regards to the pressure that that continues to have. And if you show up and stop performing and stop feeling that you need to meet those continuous expectations, that in itself would make a difference for those individuals, and then in turn all of the individuals around them, and that includes students and colleagues and et cetera, et cetera. So that, I think that's very interesting. I'd never really heard about it described in that way, but that is so on point, the idea of looking at it as white performances. So thank you both so much. We've all learned so much, and again, this, because it's been recorded as well, it will continue to be shared. Before we wrap up, any other points or anything else that you wanted to add in terms of just kind of concluding the Q&A for tonight?
I just wanted to say that the whole project is so cool, and it was an honor to have been invited into it, and it just gave me so much hope, you know. So thank you.
Same things. So it was, yeah, honor to be asked to be involved. And so thank you for that. And I guess my parting thought for those who are partaking, listening, and everything else is think about the sequence. The sequence was quite intentional, right? So what does this lens of looking at the rest of the modules through the lens of white supremacy, what does that do for the ask of you as an individual? And I think that that is going to be different. When we talk about equality and equity, the equality is we're all asked to do something. The equity is that we're going to be asked to do something slightly different. So what is that different thing that's being asked of you in the role that you have? And maybe that is because of the position that you have to the students or the identity that you embody, but what is that thing that's being asked of you? And so as Flora articulated, it's the idea of, is it something that's internal? Is it just there? Is it something that's internal and external? What is asked of you? How are you showing up? And you know, taking it from that lens is something that could be quite powerful.
Great. Thank you both so much. Again, such a pleasure to work with both of you. And comment as well, Catherine said, thank you so much. This was really great, and what a wonderful start.
Right on. Thanks so much. Take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great evening, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
I'm the need for all. How do I do this? Oh, I have to stop this.